Last Friday was the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund 23rd Annual Candlelight Vigil, which was part of National Police Week. I was hoping to catch up with a few members of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition to interview there, but got lost in a sea of cops. However, as any good spy would, I decided to get interviews with the police officers in attendance. Some were very forthright once they got in front of the camera. Some froze when I started asking real questions. Most of those I approached said, "Talk to my boss," one way or another. And I ended up interviewing some pretty high-ranking police officers. But then we noticed that Attorney General Eric Holder was at the event as well, as a guest of honor, seated right by the podium. That means he had to sit through hours and hours of speeches, songs, give a speech himself, then personally lead off the reading of slain officers' names that were to be added to the memorial, which alone took a couple of hours. It was after all this that we were able to catch up to him at the end of the event. I'm trying to get a quick question with the Attorney General.
To my right.
Okay, to your right.
10-8.
To your right. Excuse me, sir. Adam Kokesh, RT America. What do you have to say to Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, who would say that ending the war on drugs would lower the rate of deaths of law enforcement officers unnecessarily in the line of duty?
I don't think that's right.
You don't think that less officers would die in the line of duty if the drug war was ended, sir?
No.
Close.
Back off.
Guys.
Welcome back to Adam versus the Man. Joining me now in studio is Sean Dunnigan, who served as an intelligence research specialist for the United States Drug Enforcement Administration from 1998 to 2011. Also joining us from Philadelphia is Major Neil Franklin, a 33-year law enforcement veteran of both the Maryland State Police and Baltimore Police Forces. He worked the streets, he investigated, who supervised and trained others, and oversaw 17 drug task forces. He has seen colleagues die in the line of fire unnecessarily in the war on drugs and is now the executive director of law enforcement. Got a website up befitting. Check it out, leap.cc. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Neil, first to you. The response from Attorney General Holder yesterday when presented with the premise of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition about saving officers' lives by ending the war on drugs was met with a very curt response. Just, that's not right. Were you surprised by his condemnation of LEAP?
I was really surprised by his answer. I expected a little bit more. I expected a little bit more thought. I expected him to have more information, especially since this was Friday evening. I believe this was right after. And, you know, for the top cop in our country to not have that information about how many of us are dying, and let me say this, civilians, cops, those in the gang, people are dying every day by the hundreds across this country and in South America, Mexico, Venezuela. But as it relates to police officers, I'm really surprised that he did not have that information, or at least have some sense of the numbers that are dying across this country. And I can tell you one thing, the FBI doesn't keep appropriate statistics as it relates to this topic. But for him to say no, none, it wouldn't make a difference. Ending the war on drugs would not make a difference in police officers' deaths. He's missing a lot of information, and I'm saddened by that.
Yeah, no, it would be one thing almost if he acknowledged the facts and said, I understand there's a human cost here, let's debate if it's worth it, but not even to that point. Sean, from the big picture, from your perspective, from the DEA perhaps, is there any way that Attorney General Holder could be telling the truth here? Is there any conceivable way that ending the war on drugs might increase the liability or the risk for police officers?
No, absolutely not. In the tumultuous 1960s, we lost about 155 officers a year in the line of duty. That was the average for the decade. 1970s, the drug war comes along with Nixon, and that figure shot up to 229 a year. The same thing happened during Prohibition. That was the most dangerous time in our history to be a cop in this country. We lost about 240 a year during the 13 years of Prohibition. In the 10 years after its repeal, that figure dropped to about 146. So he's completely being dishonest or hasn't bothered to look at the statistics.
It's amazing. Neil?
Yeah, Sean's right. Hey, Sean, how you doing?
Good. How are you, sir?
Doing well. That's why I like Sean so much. He's so good with those numbers and stats.
Excellent. Well, you know, we were at the vigil as well on Friday. This is where we ran into the Attorney General, and we got to interview some of the law enforcement officers there about whether or not the vigil itself, seeing this tragedy up close, having that moment of remembrance, spurred any conversations about changing the policy for them. If that led to any reconsideration of the policies that they were leading to enforce, as you have with LEAP. We got some really interesting answers. I'd like to play a couple and get your responses. Some were speaking more freely than others. This was the first one from a gentleman that was a little bit reserved in his comments. Let's play the first clip.
I'm not saying that the war on drugs is making us risk our lives or anything. This is a line of work that we chose to do, and we're going to do it to the best of our ability.
Do you think that this kind of denial at the bottom-up level within the law enforcement community is really that prevalent, or is this just a guy because he's talking to the press? Oh, no, of course we don't really risk our lives for the drug war. Sean?
Well, I think, you know, he's an officer, you know, appears to be a rank-and-file officer, so he's going to kind of follow the party line, so to speak. You know, that's what they're taught, and that's what they have to profess. You know, it's very difficult for an officer that's currently serving to come out and say anything to the contrary, and that's...
Well, Neil, you've got a little more experience on the streets with this kind of mentality. Is this really prevalent? Is this what most law enforcement officers believe in, or is there a deeper understanding settling in with the ranks?
Well, it is prevalent. One thing you have to understand, at least for me, I was there. I was exactly where he was. Most of my career was in drug enforcement, and I had that perspective that gentleman had. You know, we're soldiers, we're giving out orders, we know what the laws are, we're going to go out there and enforce them. That's what we do, and we're going to do it to the best of our abilities. But when you get the information, when you sit down and look at the numbers, not just financially, but the body count, when you look at the waste, of our young people in our communities and process that, then you come to a realization that, you know what, this is not working, and it is costing this country a great deal. So I think that when we have the opportunity to give them that information and to give them the opportunity to really think about it, and as Sean said, to relieve that pressure that they feel to toe the party line, you'll get a completely different answer.
All right, well, we have from perhaps the party line generator himself, we have from a very high-ranking officer, I apologize, I don't remember the department he was with, but the head of one of the New York City departments, and we have a clip of him talking about how policies have changed over time and law enforcement's role related to that. Let's play that clip.
Police officers not so very long ago on one day would be arresting women walking into abortion clinics, and the very next day were arresting people trying to prevent them from doing that. It's not the job of the police to tell society what to do. It's the job of society to direct the police as to what the police should do. And once that decision is made, the police really have no choice.
No choice. Is there really no choice left to law enforcement officers on the ground being asked to do things they might consider wrong? Neil?
Well, this is a complex issue here, but this is the case. Once the people, through their policymakers, decide what law enforcement wants to do, what they want law enforcement to do, just like he said, that's what we're charged with. Now, it doesn't, we still have limitations. There's still a range in which we can enforce those policies. I mean, we can, and this, I need to give an example here. For instance, if marijuana is still illegal by law in your community, you're given some latitude. You're expected to go out there and enforce those laws, because if you don't, you can be brought up on charges for neglect of duty. However, you have to look at the policy and the latitude that that policy gives you. For instance, as a police officer, I can get your information, I could seize the drugs, and I can, you know, as long as I'm comfortable with your identification, knowing who you are, I can file a criminal summons for you. I don't have to take you to prison. I don't have to take you to the detention center. Or I can if I want to. Okay, so I could take you to the other end of the spectrum, put cuffs on you, and take you in, and maybe you have to spend a day or two in prison before you can make bail or have your initial hearing. So there's some latitude there.
Now, Neil, it may be patently obvious how wrong-headed Eric Holder's statement on Friday was and how absurd it was just on face of the facts. But you have a personal story that drives home some of this. Would you care to share that with us tonight?
Yeah, and that's what really disturbed me, and of course that's why I was there on Friday. I was there celebrating the life of Ed Totley, and it was just a couple miles from where we had this ceremony where Ed Totley was assassinated, where he was killed 10 years ago, 10 and a half years ago, October of 2000. I received a call in the middle of the night, and it was a comrade telling me that Ed Totley, who just wasn't a close friend of mine, he had worked for me on a couple occasions, and he told me that Ed Totley had been shot and that it didn't look good. And immediately I knew what it was from, because Ed and I, just a couple weeks prior to that, had a conversation about this final purchase of cocaine that he was about to make from this mid-level dealer in Washington, D.C. So Ed was working with the FBI that night on a task force, and this guy, Kofi Orleans Lindsay, decided that he wanted to keep the money and the drugs. So when he returned to Ed's car, where he should have had the drugs, he just shot Ed at point-blank range. And it was one of the worst nights of my life. One of the worst nights of my life. And my wife and I drove down to the hospital, and of course, by the time we got there, it was, just tons of friends and other comrades and his wife, and he had 3 kids. And this is just one case of many. And when that happened to Ed, I immediately thought about Marty Ward. When I was working undercover in the 1980s, he was assassinated in Baltimore City. I thought about Billy Martin, another Baltimore police officer who was killed in the 1980s. And then after Ed's assassination, we had 2 more Baltimore police officers killed. Michael Cowdery was approaching 2 drug dealers on the corner of Harford Road to do an interview, and one of them shot him. And then Kayvon Gavin, his car was broadsided when the police were chasing a fleeing drug dealer. Gavin was in his marked patrol vehicle, and this guy intentionally rammed into the side of Gavin. And this guy was wearing a bulletproof vest, a ballistic vest, heavily armed, and he had just shot one of his rivals. So, Eric Holder can't tell me that it wouldn't make a difference. And those are clear-cut cases. And there's so many other indirect cases as well.
Neil, thank you for sharing your stories tonight. Sean, from the DEA's perspective, is there any connection with the kind of tragedies that cops on the beat see every day with the drug war?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's a dangerous job, and it's a dangerous job because of the prohibition scheme. People aren't shooting each other over liquor distribution or beer distribution. They're shooting each other over drug distribution. So, all of these tragedies are really a function of the policies that are in place, and I would dare say that Eric Holder is aware of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Neil Franklin, Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and former DEA analyst Sean Dunnigan here in studio with us tonight.